The champagne flutes shattered against marble floors as Francesca Leiscourt's ultimatum echoed through the boardroom like a death sentence. The most powerful CEO in Millbrook Heights had just cornered Sandro Dramere, the quiet janitor who cleaned her offices after midnight, with an offer that defied every rule of corporate conduct and human decency. "Become my husband or lose everything," she declared, her manicured finger pointing at the man whose calloused hands had unknowingly held the key to her empire's survival. But Francesca had gravely miscalculated. She thought she knew everything about the soft-spoken carpenter who emptied her trash bins and mopped her floors. She thought desperation would make him compliant, that his working-class background would make him grateful for her attention. What she didn't know was that Sandro Dramere carried secrets that would not only shock the entire corporate world, but completely reverse the power dynamic she thought she controlled. Sometimes the person you underestimate the most holds all the cards. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Francesca Leiscourt commanded the 53rd floor of Meridian Tower like a general surveying conquered territory. From her corner office, the city of Millbrook Heights spread below in neat geometric patterns of wealth and ambition, each building a testament to the empire she'd built from nothing. At 34, she was the youngest CEO in Leiscourt Industries history, having clawed her way to the top through a combination of ruthless intelligence and an unwavering refusal to show weakness that the morning ritual never varied. 7 a.m. sharp, she arrived in her black Bentley, Italian heels clicking across marble as she strode through the lobby without acknowledging the security guards or reception staff who snapped to attention. By 7:15, she was reviewing overnight reports from her global operations. By 8, she was dissecting the previous day's performance metrics with her executive team, her sharp blue eyes missing nothing as she identified inefficiencies and demanded explanations. Francesca had inherited a failing textile company from her grandfather at 25, but within a decade, she'd transformed it into a diversified corporate empire spanning real estate, technology, and manufacturing. The business journals called her the Iron Maiden of Millbrook Heights, a title she wore with pride. Emotions were liabilities. Sentimentality was expensive. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford, especially after her ex-fiancé had tried to steal her company secrets to fuel his own startup. Her penthouse apartment in Silvermere District reflected her philosophy: clean lines, expensive materials, everything perfectly controlled. She lived alone by choice, finding human relationships messier and less predictable than quarterly earnings reports. The few men who'd attempted to court her had either been intimidated by her success or revealed themselves to be fortune hunters. She preferred her solitude to the complications of romance. 53 floors below, in the basement levels of Meridian Tower, Sandro Dramere pushed his cleaning cart through empty corridors with quiet efficiency. The overnight janitorial shift suited him perfectly, providing steady income while allowing him to maintain his real passion during daylight hours. Most people saw only the janitor's uniform, the mop and bucket, the invisible man who cleaned up after their daily lives. They had no idea that by day, he was one of Millbrook Heights' most sought-after custom furniture craftsmen. Sandro had learned carpentry from his grandfather, an Italian immigrant who'd built half the historic homes in the city's Old Brook Quarter with his bare hands. The old man had taught him that wood had its own wisdom, that patience and respect could coax beauty from the roughest timber. These lessons had served Sandro well, both in his craft and in life. His workshop, tucked away in the Industrial Ironworks District, was a world apart from the sterile corporate towers. Hand tools hung in precise arrangements, wood shavings carpeted the floor, and the air carried the rich scent of cedar, oak, and walnut. Wealthy clients sought him out for custom dining tables, bedroom sets, and library installations, willing to wait months for pieces that would become family heirlooms. The irony wasn't lost on him that he spent his nights cleaning the offices of people who paid thousands for his furniture without ever connecting the name on their commission contracts to the quiet man emptying their wastebaskets. He preferred it that way. Anonymity was a form of freedom, allowing him to observe without being observed, to understand the true nature of people when they thought no one was watching. At 41, Sandro had learned to value substance over appearance. His small apartment in Maplewood was furnished entirely with pieces he'd crafted himself, each one a meditation on form and function. He lived simply but richly, finding joy in the grain of a particularly beautiful piece of cherry wood or the satisfaction of a perfectly fitted joint. Their worlds intersected only in the liminal space of midnight, when Francesca's corporate kingdom emptied and Sandro's cleaning shift began. He'd noticed her working late more frequently in recent months, staying past midnight to review documents or conduct video conferences with international partners. Sometimes he'd glimpse her through glass office walls, perfectly composed even at 2 a.m., attacking spreadsheets with the same intensity she brought to everything else. Sandro had developed a routine around her late-night presence. He'd clean the outer offices first, giving her time to finish her work before moving to the executive suite. On the rare occasions when their paths crossed in the hallway, she'd nod curtly without making eye contact, her mind clearly occupied with more important matters than acknowledging the help. He found her fascinating in the way one might study a rare and dangerous species. Her reputation preceded her through the building like a weather system, affecting everyone's mood and behavior. Junior executives trembled before her presentations. Senior staff measured their words carefully in her presence. She wielded power with surgical precision, cutting away weakness and inefficiency without apparent emotion. Yet, Sandro had observed something others missed during those midnight encounters. Sometimes when she thought she was completely alone, Francesca would pause at her window, staring out at the city with an expression that wasn't quite sadness, but wasn't satisfaction either. In those unguarded moments, she looked less like the Iron Maiden, and more like a woman who'd achieved everything she'd ever wanted and discovered it wasn't enough. The buildings, security cameras captured their separate existences like parallel documentaries. Francesca arriving each morning in power suits that cost more than most people's monthly rent, departing each evening in the same Bentley that whisked her away to charity galas and board meetings. Sandro arriving each night through the service entrance, departing each morning as the city woke up, their schedules perfectly synchronized to avoid intersection. Both lived with secrets. Francesca hid the crushing loneliness behind her success, the way victory had come to taste like ashes when there was no one to share it with. Sandro concealed the true extent of his craftsmanship and the intellectual depth that made him one of the most perceptive observers of human nature in the city. Neither suspected that their carefully maintained distance was about to collapse in the most dramatic way possible, setting in motion events that would challenge everything they thought they knew about power, worth, and the price of getting exactly what you thought you wanted. The stage was set for a collision between two people who'd spent years perfecting the art of emotional isolation, who were about to discover that the most dangerous battles are fought not in boardrooms or workshops, but in the vulnerable spaces between what we present to the world and who we really are. The crisis began on a Tuesday that started like any other. Francesca arrived at Meridian Tower to find her head of security, her chief financial officer, and her lead counsel waiting in her outer office with expressions that immediately set her nerves on edge. Bad news always traveled in packs, and the grim faces told her this would be catastrophic. "Ma'am, we need to discuss a significant security breach," her security chief began, his military bearing unable to hide his obvious discomfort. "Our investigation has uncovered irregularities in several recent acquisitions." What followed was 2 hours of devastating revelations. Someone with intimate knowledge of her business operations had been systematically undermining her most important deals. Contract negotiations she'd thought were confidential had been leaked to competitors. Strategic plans had been shared with hostile parties. Her expansion into the European markets had been sabotaged by someone who knew exactly which suppliers to target and which partnerships to disrupt. The financial impact was staggering. Nearly $200 million in lost opportunities, damaged relationships with key partners, and a reputation for unreliability that threatened to destroy decades of careful relationship building. More troubling was the surgical precision of the attacks, suggesting someone with administrative-level access to her most sensitive information. "The breach appears to be internal," her CFO reported grimly. "Someone with security clearance has been feeding information to Blackstone Enterprises." Francesca felt her blood freeze. Blackstone Enterprises was run by Richard Blackstone, her former fiancé and the man who'd tried to steal her company's secrets 3 years ago. She'd thought that nightmare was behind her, but apparently Richard had found a new way to strike at the heart of her empire. "How extensive is the damage?" she asked, her voice steady despite the chaos churning in her mind. "We're looking at potential bankruptcy within 6 months if the sabotage continues," her counsel admitted. "The European deals were supposed to generate the cash flow we need for the Millbrook Commons development. Without them, we can't service our debt obligations." The rest of the day passed in a blur of emergency meetings, damage control calls, and strategic planning sessions that felt increasingly like battlefield triage. By evening, the scope of the betrayal was clear. Someone in her inner circle had systematically sold out her most important business secrets, and the financial consequences threatened to destroy everything she'd built. As midnight approached and the building emptied, Francesca remained at her desk, poring over personnel files and access logs, trying to identify the traitor in her organization. The investigation had narrowed the suspects to a handful of people with the necessary clearance levels, but the evidence remained frustratingly inconclusive. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. That's when she noticed something that made her pause. The cleaning logs showed that janitorial services had been performed on several key evenings when sensitive documents had been left unsecured. The overnight cleaning crew had access to every office, every file cabinet, every computer that hadn't been properly locked down. Her security chief had dismissed the janitorial staff as unlikely suspects, noting their background checks and the fact that they worked for a contracted service company rather than directly for Lysgard Industries. But Francesca had built her career on questioning assumptions others took for granted. She pulled up the personnel files for the overnight cleaning crew and found herself staring at a photograph that stopped her cold. Sandro Drammer, age 41, employed by Citywood Cleaning Services for the past 3 years. Clean background check, no criminal record, described by supervisors as reliable and thorough. But something nagged at her. She'd seen him dozens of times during her late-night work sessions, and there had always been something different about him. Unlike the other cleaning staff who hurried through their tasks with their heads down, Sandro moved with quiet confidence, his eyes alert and intelligent. She'd attributed it to professionalism, but now she wondered if there had been more calculation in his behavior. Francesca began making calls, starting with Citywood Cleaning Services. What she discovered sent shockwaves through her already reeling world. Sandro Drammer had been specifically requested for the Meridian Tower contract 3 years ago. The request had come through a shell company that, after several layers of investigation, traced back to Blackstone Enterprises. Her hands trembled as she connected the dots. Richard had planted a spy in her building, someone with access to her offices during the vulnerable overnight hours when security was minimal and sensitive documents might be left unguarded. Someone who could photograph contracts, copy files, and observe her business patterns without arousing suspicion. The betrayal cut deeper than professional sabotage. She realized that for months, she'd been unconsciously comfortable with Sandro's presence during her late-night work sessions. She'd even found his quiet efficiency somewhat reassuring, a steady presence in the building when she worked alone. The thought that those moments of perceived solitude had actually been periods of surveillance made her feel violated in ways that went beyond business. But as she dug deeper into the investigation, more pieces of the puzzle began to surface, and they painted a picture that was far more complex than simple corporate espionage. Sandro Draymir wasn't just a janitor. Public records showed him as the owner of Draymir Custom Woodworks, a high-end furniture company that had been growing steadily over the past decade. His client list was impressive, including several prominent families in Millbrook Heights and a number of high-profile commercial installations. The financial record suggested someone with significant business acumen and a substantial personal net worth. This wasn't a desperate man who could be easily bought for corporate secrets. More intriguingly, cross-referencing his business dealings revealed something that made Francesca's pulse quicken. Sandro had recently completed a major furniture installation for the Millbrook Heights Museum of Art, the same museum that was scheduled to be demolished to make way for her Millbrook Commons development project, the project that was now in jeopardy because of the financial damage from the corporate sabotage. Project that, if it failed, would trigger the debt obligations that could destroy her company. Sitting alone in her office at 2 a.m., surrounded by evidence of betrayal and facing the potential collapse of her empire, Francesca felt something she hadn't experienced in years: genuine uncertainty. But alongside the fear came something else, something that felt almost like excitement. For the first time in her career, she was facing an opponent who had managed to surprise her completely. Sandro Draymir wasn't just a janitor or a simple corporate spy. He was something far more dangerous and far more interesting. An equal who had been hiding in plain sight. The discovery changed everything. This wasn't just about identifying a security breach or plugging a leak in her organization. This was about a man who had spent 3 years studying her, learning her patterns, understanding her vulnerabilities, all while maintaining the perfect disguise of invisibility. But two could play at games of deception and strategy. Francesca had built her reputation on turning disadvantages into victories, on finding ways to weaponize what others saw as weaknesses. If Sandro thought he could destroy her empire through subtle sabotage, he was about to learn that the Iron Maiden of Millbrook Heights didn't surrender quietly. As dawn broke over the city, Francesca made a decision that would have seemed impossible just 24 hours earlier. She was going to confront Sandro Draymir directly, but not in the way he would expect. She was going to offer him something that would test not just his loyalty to Richard Blackstone, but his fundamental understanding of power itself. The game was about to change, and Francesca intended to control every move. Sandro arrived for his shift that night, expecting routine, empty offices, scattered paperwork, and the familiar rhythm of methodical cleaning that had structured his evenings for 3 years. Instead, he found Francesca Lyscourt waiting in the executive conference room, seated at the head of a polished mahogany table that gleamed under harsh fluorescent lights. She'd changed from her usual business attire into something more casual, but no less commanding. A black silk blouse and tailored pants that suggested this wasn't a chance encounter. The way she'd positioned herself, framed by floor-to-ceiling windows that revealed the glittering expanse of Millbrook Heights below, sent an unmistakable message about who controlled this conversation. "Mr. Draymir," she said without preamble. "Please, sit down." Sandro paused in the doorway, his cleaning cart blocking his exit, mind racing through possibilities. Had she discovered something? Was this about overtime regulations or some complaint about his work? He'd been scrupulously careful to maintain his cover, never taking photographs of documents, never accessing computers, never doing anything that could be construed as suspicious. "I'm sorry, Ms. Lyscourt, but I need to complete my rounds," he said carefully, keeping his voice neutral. "Perhaps we could schedule a meeting through proper channels if there's an issue with my work." Francesca smiled, and something in that expression made Sandro's instincts scream warnings. It wasn't the polite, dismissive smile she gave to subordinates. It was the smile of a predator who'd cornered prey. "Oh, I think we're well past proper channels, don't you?" She gestured to a manila folder on the table. Please, sit. We have quite a lot to discuss about your relationship with Blackstone Enterprises. The name hit Sandro like a physical blow. His careful composure wavered for just a moment, long enough for Francesca to register the reaction before he schooled his features back to neutral. But that moment was enough. She'd seen the flicker of recognition, the instant of calculation behind his dark eyes. I'm not sure what you're referring to, Sandro said, but he moved into the room, leaving his cart in the hallway. The lie felt heavy on his tongue, and he could see from Francesca's expression that she wasn't buying it for a second. Really? Francesca opened the folder with theatrical precision. Because I have quite extensive documentation of your actual relationship with my former fiancé, the shell company that requested your specific assignment to this building. The timing of various information leaks that correspond perfectly with your work schedule. The rather substantial payments that have been flowing into accounts connected to your woodworking business. Sandro felt the walls closing in but forced himself to remain calm. 3 years of careful planning, of building trust and establishing patterns, had led to this moment. But this wasn't how it was supposed to happen. Richard had assured him that Francesca would never connect the dots, that her arrogance would blind her to threats from people she considered beneath her. Notice, I clean offices, he said simply. I don't know anything about corporate espionage or shell companies. Don't. Francesca's voice cut through his denial like a blade. Don't insult my intelligence by maintaining this charade. I know exactly who you are, Sandro Dremir. I know about your furniture business, your impressive client list, and your rather substantial net worth. I know you're nobody's desperate janitor willing to sell secrets for pocket change. She stood and walked to the windows, her silhouette imposing against the city lights. When she turned back, her expression had shifted from predatory satisfaction to something more complex, almost curious. What I don't know, she continued, is why a successful businessman would spend 3 years mopping floors and emptying trash cans just to gather intelligence. For Richard Blackstone, what could he possibly have offered you that would make such an elaborate deception worthwhile? The question hung in the air between them. Sandro realized that his cover was completely blown, but something in Francesca's tone suggested this wasn't leading where he'd expected. She wasn't calling security or threatening prosecution. She was genuinely curious about his motivations, and that curiosity felt dangerous in ways that legal threats wouldn't. You wouldn't understand, he said finally, deciding that partial truth was his best remaining strategy. Try me. Sandro studied her face, looking for signs of manipulation or trap setting, but found only genuine interest. After 3 years of observing her from the shadows, he'd learned to read her expressions with considerable accuracy. This wasn't the face she wore when negotiating hostile takeovers or crushing business rivals. This was something rarer, authentic curiosity. Richard didn't offer me money, he said slowly. He offered me information. Francesca raised an eyebrow. What kind of information? About the Millbrook Commons development. About what you plan to do to the museum district. Sandro's voice hardened. About the communities you were going to displace and the history you were going to erase for profit. Understanding dawned in Francesca's eyes, and with it came something that might have been respect. You're not working for Richard at all, are you? You're working against me. The museum holds pieces my grandfather created when he helped build this city, Sandro said, no longer bothering to hide the passion in his voice. The apartments you want to demolish house families who've lived in those neighborhoods for generations. You saw real estate opportunities. I saw vandalism on an industrial scale. Francesca walked back to the table, her movements deliberate and controlled. But Sandro could see the wheels turning behind her eyes, reassessing everything she thought she knew about the situation. So you infiltrated my company to sabotage the development project. I gathered information to help the community groups fight your plans through legal channels, Sandro corrected. Everything I passed along was intended to help them mount proper opposition, not to enrich Richard Blackstone, but you had to know that your information was helping Richard damage my business in other areas too. Sandro's jaw tightened. That had been the part of the arrangement that troubled his conscience, but Richard had convinced him it was necessary collateral damage. I thought if your company was weakened, you'd be forced to abandon the development project. Instead, you may have doomed it anyway. Francesca sat back down, her expression thoughtful. The financial damage from the other sabotage means I can't fund the development, even if I wanted to proceed. The admission surprised Sandro. He'd expected denials, threats, or legal maneuvering. Instead, Francesca seemed to be treating this like a strategic briefing, analyzing the situation with the same clinical detachment she applied to quarterly earnings reports. You're not what I expected, she said after a moment of silence. Neither are you. They looked at each other across the conference table, two people who'd spent years constructing careful facades, now seeing past them for the first time. The dynamic between them had shifted fundamentally. This wasn't employer and employee, or even adversaries in a corporate battle. This was something more complex and potentially more dangerous. I have a proposition for you, Francesca said suddenly. Sandro felt his pulse quicken. I'm listening. You've spent 3 years studying my business operations. You understand my company's vulnerabilities and strengths better than most of my executives. You've proven you can think strategically and execute complex long-term plans. She leaned forward, her blue eyes fixed on his face. I'm going to offer you a choice. What kind of choice? Francesca's smile returned, but now it carried a different quality entirely. It was the smile of someone about to make an offer that would change everything. You can continue your current path. Face criminal charges for corporate espionage. Watch your furniture business collapse under legal scrutiny, and achieve nothing except the satisfaction of having temporarily inconvenienced me. She paused for effect. Or you can accept a different arrangement entirely, which is, become my husband, and I'll make you a full partner in rebuilding this company and redesigning the Millbrook Commons project to preserve the elements you're fighting to protect. The words hit Sandro like a physical force. He stared at her, trying to process what he'd just heard, wondering if he'd misunderstood or if this was some elaborate psychological manipulation. That's insane, he said finally. Is it? Francesca stood again, beginning to pace around the table like a general planning a campaign. Think about it strategically. You want to protect the museum and the historic neighborhoods. I need someone I can trust absolutely to help rebuild my company's reputation and financial position. Marriage would give you legal standing to influence all major business decisions. You can't be serious. I'm completely serious. This isn't about romance or emotion. It's about pragmatic problem solving. She stopped directly in front of him. You've proven you can outmaneuver me when you're working as an enemy. Imagine what you could accomplish as an ally with actual legal authority. Sandro felt like the ground had shifted beneath his feet. This wasn't at all how he'd expected this confrontation to unfold. He'd prepared for legal threats, for attempts to buy his silence, even for physical intimidation. He hadn't prepared for a marriage proposal wrapped in corporate strategy. And if I refuse? Francesca's expression hardened. Then I pursue every legal remedy available for corporate espionage and industrial sabotage. Your business won't survive the scandal, your reputation will be destroyed, and the communities you're trying to protect will lose their most knowledgeable advocate. You're blackmailing me into marriage. I'm offering you a chance to achieve your actual objectives instead of settling for Pyrrhic victories. She returned to her seat, her posture radiating controlled power. The choice is entirely yours, Sandro. But I need an answer tonight. Sandro stared at this woman who had just upended every assumption he'd made about power dynamics and corporate warfare. 3 years of careful planning had led to this moment, But nothing in those plans had prepared him for an opponent who would respond to infiltration with a marriage proposal. The most disturbing part was that her offer made a twisted kind of sense. As her husband, he would have legal standing to influence business decisions, protect the historic properties, and reshape the development project. But it would also mean binding himself to a woman who wielded manipulation like other people used tools, who could turn betrayal into opportunity with breathtaking efficiency. "I need time to think about this," he said. "You have until dawn," Francesca replied, checking her watch. "Security will escort you from the building at 6 a.m. regardless of your decision. If you choose to accept my offer, we can begin making arrangements immediately. If not, the lawyers take over." She stood and walked toward the door, then paused at the threshold. "For what it's worth," she said without turning around, "I respect what you were trying to accomplish. The execution was flawed, but the underlying principles weren't wrong. That's more than I can say for most of my opponents." Then she was gone, leaving Sandro alone in the conference room with a choice that would define the rest of his life and the future of everything he'd been. Fighting to protect. Sandro spent the remaining hours of his shift in a daze, mechanically pushing his cart through empty offices while his mind churned through the impossible choice Francesca had presented. By dawn, he'd reached a decision that surprised even himself. He would accept her proposal, but on his own terms. He found her in her office at 6 a.m. sharp, looking as composed as if she'd slept peacefully instead of orchestrating corporate blackmail in the middle of the night. She glanced up from her computer screen as he knocked on her open door, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Dremir, I take it you've reached a decision?" "I accept your proposal," he said, stepping into the office. "But I have conditions." Francesca leaned back in her chair, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "I'm listening." "I'm listening. First, this arrangement has a defined timeline. 2 years to stabilize your company and complete the Millbrook Commons redesign. After that, we dissolve the marriage and I retain co-ownership of any projects we develop together." "Interesting. What else?" "Second, I maintain complete independence in my furniture business. No interference, no oversight, no attempts to leverage it for corporate gain." "Agreed. Continue." Sandro had expected more resistance, but Francesca seemed genuinely interested in his terms rather than dismissive. It was another reminder that she approached everything, even personal relationships, with the calculating mindset of a strategic negotiation. "Third, we maintain separate residences. This is a business partnership with legal formalities, not a traditional marriage. I won't be playing house in your penthouse." "Actually," Francesca said, standing and walking to her window, "that's where we have our first disagreement." Sandro felt his chest tighten. "It's non-negotiable, not for the reasons you think." She turned back to face him. "The marriage needs to appear authentic to be effective. If we're living in separate places, maintaining separate social lives, the business community will see through the arrangement immediately. That undermines the entire purpose, which is demonstrating that I've changed my approach to business, that I'm now working with community representatives rather than against them." Francesca began pacing, her mind clearly working through strategic implications. "Your reputation as someone who fought to protect historic neighborhoods becomes an asset that validates my company's new direction." Sandro realized she was right, but the thought of sharing living space with her felt like surrendering the last vestige of his independence. "Where would we live?" "I own a property in Millbrook Commons that's been sitting empty for 2 years. It's in the historic district you were trying to protect, walking distance from both the museum and your workshop." She paused, watching his reaction. "We renovated together. You handle the restoration work. I handle the business implications. Our first joint project." The proposal was unexpectedly thoughtful, addressing both practical concerns and symbolic value. Sandro found himself considering it seriously, despite his instinct to maintain distance. "I'd want complete creative control over the Condro Renovation, he said, done, with one caveat. It needs to serve as a showpiece for potential investors and community leaders. Form and function need to align with our business objectives. They spent the next hour negotiating details with the intensity of diplomats drafting a treaty. Living arrangements, financial responsibilities, public appearances, decision-making authority for various business matters. Francesca approached each point with clinical precision, while Sandro fought to maintain some sense of personal autonomy within the structure she was creating. By 8 a.m., they had the framework of an agreement that felt more like a corporate merger than a marriage proposal. But as they shook hands to seal the arrangement, Sandro caught something unexpected in Francesca's expression, a flicker of vulnerability that she quickly masked. "There's something else we need to discuss," she said, returning to her desk and pulling out a new folder. "The timeline for this arrangement is more compressed than you might expect." "What do you mean?" "The board meeting to discuss the company's financial crisis is scheduled for next week. If I'm going to present this as a strategic partnership rather than damage control, we need to be married before then." She opened the folder to reveal marriage license applications and contact information for wedding planners. "I've taken the liberty of researching expedited procedures." Sandro stared at the documents, feeling the weight of how quickly his life was being reorganized. "Next week? That's impossible. Nothing's impossible with sufficient resources and motivation." Francesca's corporate efficiency was in full display. "City Hall can process the paperwork in 72 hours if properly expedited. I know several officiants who can perform ceremonies on short notice. The only real challenge is making it appear authentic rather than rushed, because rushing into marriage with a woman who's blackmailing me is such a romantic foundation." For the first time since their midnight confrontation, Francesca's composure cracked slightly. She looked genuinely stung by his characterization, though she recovered quickly. "I prefer to think of it as mutually beneficial strategic positioning," she said coolly. "Romance is inefficient and unreliable. This arrangement serves both our interests more effectively than conventional courtship." Sandro studied her face, trying to understand the woman behind the corporate strategy. "When's the last time you did anything for reasons that weren't strategic?" The question seemed to catch her off guard. She was quiet for a long moment, staring at the marriage documents as if they contained answers to questions she hadn't considered. "I don't have time for non-strategic decisions," she said finally. "Sentiment is expensive. That sounds lonely. Loneliness is also expensive." But there was something hollow in her voice that suggested the cost-benefit analysis wasn't as clear-cut as she pretended. They arranged to meet that evening at the Millbrook Commons property to assess the renovation requirements. Sandro left Meridian Tower feeling like he'd signed a contract with forces beyond his understanding, while Francesca spent the day implementing their arrangement with the same ruthless efficiency she applied to hostile takeovers. By noon, she'd spoken with 3 wedding planners, expedited their marriage license application, and scheduled appointments with a photographer who specialized in authentic-looking corporate couple portraits for business magazines. She approached wedding planning the way other people plan military campaigns, with contingency strategies and detailed timelines. But as the day progressed, small details began infiltrating her strategic thinking in ways that surprised her. What kind of flowers would Sandro prefer? Did he have family who should be invited, even to a business arrangement? What would it feel like to wear a wedding ring again after swearing she'd never make herself that vulnerable? The questions irritated her because they served no strategic purpose, yet she couldn't dismiss them entirely. There was something about Sandro's principled opposition to her business practices that had earned genuine respect. He'd outmaneuvered her completely, but for reasons that had nothing to do with personal gain. In her world of profit-driven motivation, such principled behavior was both rare and strangely compelling. That evening, they met at the Millbrook Commons property as arranged. The house was a Victorian-era mansion that had been meticulously maintained, with original hardwood floors, crown molding, and stained glass windows that caught the sunset in jewel tone patterns. Sandro walked through the rooms with professional assessment, noting structural elements and restoration possibilities. "It's beautiful," he said, running his hand along an original oak banister. "Why has it been sitting empty?" "I bought it to demolish it," Francesca admitted. "Part of the original development plan. But the community opposition was so fierce that I decided to wait for better timing." Sandro turned to stare at her. "You were going to tear this down?" "It was just real estate then. Valuable because of location, not because of craftsmanship or history." She paused, watching him examine the intricate woodwork. "I'm beginning to understand the difference." For the next 2 hours, they walked through the property discussing renovation possibilities. Sandro's knowledge of historic restoration techniques impressed Francesca, while her understanding of project management and budgeting provided practical framework for his creative ideas. Despite their mutual distrust, they found themselves working well together, their different expertise creating synergy neither had expected. As darkness fell, they stood in what would become the main living area, surrounded by dust sheets and renovation plans. The space felt heavy with possibility and uncertainty. "This could actually work," Francesca said quietly. "Not just the house. The partnership. Don't confuse effective collaboration with compatibility." Sandro replied, but there was less hostility in his voice than before. "We're both good at our jobs. That doesn't mean we can build a life together, even a temporary one. What would it take to make this bearable for you?" The question surprised him with its directness. He'd expected continued strategic maneuvering, not genuine inquiry about his comfort. "Honesty," he said after a moment. "No more manipulation disguised as business strategy. If we're going to do this, we do it as equals, not as puppet master and puppet." Francesca nodded slowly. "I can work with that. But you need to understand, strategy isn't manipulation for me. It's survival. I've learned to think 3 moves ahead because the alternative is being destroyed by people who think 5 moves ahead. Who taught you to live like that?" "Everyone." The answer came out sharper than she'd intended. "My grandfather who built this company from nothing, but died disappointed because I wasn't the grandson he'd wanted. My fiancé who tried to steal everything I built. Every competitor who's tried to exploit any sign of weakness or sentimentality." Sandro heard pain beneath the corporate armor, recognition of the cost of constant vigilance. "That's exhausting." "Yes," she said simply. "But it's effective," said simply. "But it's effective." They left the house that night with arrangements to begin renovation the following week and to be married in 72 hours. It felt surreal and practical at the same time, like stepping into an elaborate performance where the stakes were entirely real. Neither admitted it to the other, but both found themselves thinking about the evening's conversation as they returned to their separate homes. For Sandro, it was the first glimpse of the woman behind the corporate strategy. For Francesca, it was the first time in years that someone had asked about her well-being rather than her business plans. Arrangement was beginning to feel less like blackmail and more like the most complicated business partnership either of them had ever undertaken. But whether that was progress or simply more effective manipulation remained to be seen. The wedding took place on a Thursday morning in the private gardens of Meridian Tower, witnessed by a handful of carefully selected individuals who could serve as credible testimony to the authenticity of the arrangement. Francesca had orchestrated every detail with her usual precision, but even she couldn't entirely control the surreal quality of marrying a man she'd met in a midnight confrontation less than a week earlier. Sandro wore a charcoal suit he'd purchased specifically for the occasion, while Francesca chose an elegant cream-colored dress that suggested celebration without the traditional white that would have felt hypocritical. They exchanged vows they'd written collaboratively, focusing on partnership, mutual respect, and shared commitment to community development rather than traditional promises of love and Devotion. The ceremony lasted exactly 27 minutes. The photographer captured images that would later appear in business magazines as evidence of Francesca's new approach to corporate responsibility. By noon, they were legally married and scheduled to move into the Millbrook Commons house that weekend. The first week of cohabitation was an exercise in careful negotiation of personal space and domestic logistics. They established separate bedrooms, separate bathrooms, and a shared workspace where they could collaborate on business matters without encroaching on each other's privacy. Meals were scheduled around their different work patterns. Francesca's corporate schedule and Sandro's split between renovation work during the day and furniture commissions in the evening. But as they began the actual renovation work, something unexpected began to emerge. Their professional collaboration, which had started as pragmatic necessity, began developing into genuine partnership. Francesca's project management skills complemented Sandro's craftsmanship in ways that surprised both of them. The original molding can be restored, Sandro explained, showing her damaged sections in what would become the dining room. But it requires specialized techniques and materials that will add significant time and cost to the timeline. Define significant, Francesca replied, making notes on her tablet. 6 weeks instead of 2, and probably 40% more than we budgeted for materials. In the old days, Francesca would have automatically chosen the faster, cheaper option that served her immediate business needs. But watching Sandro examine the intricate woodwork with almost reverent attention, she found herself considering different priorities. What's the long-term value differential? She asked instead. Authentic restoration increases property value substantially, especially in a historic district. Plus, it demonstrates genuine commitment to preservation rather than cosmetic renovation. Sandro looked up from the molding. But I understand if budget constraints require compromise. Show me how to do it. The request surprised them both. Francesca had intended it as a purely business question, but hearing herself ask for hands-on instruction felt like stepping into unfamiliar territory. It's detail work, Sandro warned. Requires patience and precision. I have both when they serve my purposes. For the next hour, Sandro taught Francesca the basics of wood restoration, guiding her hands as she learned to feel for the grain, to work with the wood rather than against it. Her corporate precision translated surprisingly well to craftsmanship, though she initially approached the work with the same intensity she brought to business negotiations. Slower, Sandro corrected gently, his hands covering hers to demonstrate the proper technique. The wood will tell you what it needs if you listen. The physical proximity should have felt awkward given the artificial nature of their relationship, but instead, Francesca found herself oddly comfortable with Sandro's patient instruction. His teaching style was completely different from the competitive environment she was used to, focused on understanding rather than performance. I can see why you love this, she said after successfully completing a small section. There's something satisfying about creating something beautiful from raw materials. It's not about creating, Sandro corrected. It's about revealing what was already there. The beauty exists in the wood. I just remove what's hiding it. The philosophy struck Francesca as surprisingly applicable to business leadership, though she didn't say so. Instead, she continued working, finding unexpected peace in the meditative rhythm of restoration. That evening, as they shared a simple dinner in their partially renovated kitchen, Francesca brought up something that had been nagging at her. I've been reviewing the financial projections for the museum district preservation, she said, consulting notes on her tablet. The math doesn't work with conventional development approaches, which is why you originally planned to demolish everything and start over. Exactly. But there might be another approach. She turned the tablet toward him, showing architectural renderings and financial models. What if we develop around the existing structures instead of replacing them? Integrate new construction with historic preservation? Sandro studied the plans, his expression growing more interested as he absorbed the implications. This would be significantly more complex than traditional development, but potentially more profitable in the long term, and definitely more sustainable from a community relations standpoint. Francesca was warming to the concept as she spoke. We market it as luxury heritage living, premium pricing justified by unique historic character. Been thinking about this since our conversation at the property. I've been thinking about a lot of things since our conversation at the property. The admission came out more personal than she'd intended, but she didn't retract it. They spent the rest of the evening working through the concept, combining Francesca's business analysis with Sandro's understanding of historic architecture and community needs. What emerged was a development approach that neither could have conceived alone, profitable without being exploitative, respectful of community concerns without sacrificing business viability. This could actually work, Sandro said as they spread final sketches across their dining room table. But it would require a completely different approach to community engagement. Meaning, instead of presenting finished plans for approval, we involve community representatives in the design process. Make them partners rather than obstacles. He looked at her directly. It means giving up some control in exchange for genuine collaboration. The suggestion challenged everything Francesca had learned about business strategy, where control was power and compromise was weakness. But she'd begun to see how Sandro's approach to woodworking, patient and responsive to the material's natural characteristics, might apply to community development. Set up meetings with the neighborhood associations, she said finally. But we go in as partners, not adversaries. Over the following weeks, their collaboration deepened in ways neither had anticipated. Francesca found herself genuinely curious about Sandro's craftsmanship, often watching him work on furniture commissions in the evenings. His workshop became a place where she could escape the constant strategic thinking that dominated her corporate life. Sandro, meanwhile, gained appreciation for Francesca's business acumen as he watched her navigate complex negotiations with city planning officials, community leaders, and potential investors. Her ability to find creative solutions to seemingly impossible problems impressed him, even when he disagreed with her methods. You're different when you're not trying to intimidate people, he observed one evening, finding her reviewing contracts at their kitchen table. Intimidation is a tool, she replied without looking up. Effective in some contexts, counterproductive in others. When did you learn to think about personal relationships as tools? The question made her pause, pen suspended over the contract she'd been reviewing. I don't think I learned it. I think it was always necessary for survival. That's not an answer. Francesca set down her pen and considered him across the table. After 3 weeks of close proximity, she'd begun to recognize when Sandro was genuinely curious versus when he was making polite conversation. This felt like genuine curiosity. My grandfather built this company from nothing, but he never trusted anyone completely. He taught me that business relationships were fundamentally transactional, that emotional attachment made you vulnerable to exploitation. She traced patterns on the table with her finger. Every relationship I've had has eventually proven him right. Including this one? This one is explicitly transactional. That makes it more honest than most. Sandro considered this. But it's also changing into something else. Francesca looked up sharply. What do you mean? We're becoming partners. Real partners, not just strategic allies. The work we're doing together, the plans we're making, the way we've learned to collaborate. That's not transactional anymore. The observation unsettled her because it was accurate. Somewhere in the process of renovation and business planning, she'd begun to value Sandro's opinions not just for their strategic utility, but for their inherent thoughtfulness. She looked forward to their evening conversations, found herself considering how decisions would affect him as well as her business interests. Partnership doesn't negate the underlying arrangement, she said carefully. Doesn't it? When's the last time you made a major business decision without considering my perspective? Francesca realized she couldn't remember. Without conscious intention, She'd begun incorporating Sandro's community-focused approach into her corporate strategy, not because it served her interests, but because his perspective had genuinely changed how she viewed those interests. That's just effective collaboration, is it? Or is it trust? The word hung between them like a challenge. Trust was the thing Francesca had systematically eliminated from her business relationships, the vulnerability she'd trained herself not to afford. Yet here was Sandro, suggesting she'd inadvertently developed exactly what she'd sworn to avoid. "I don't know," she said honestly. "That's progress," Sandro replied with a slight smile. 6 months ago, you would have denied the possibility entirely. As their first month of marriage concluded, both found themselves in unfamiliar territory. The strategic arrangement had evolved into genuine partnership. Professional collaboration had developed emotional dimensions, and the careful boundaries they'd established were becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. Neither was ready to admit that their fake marriage was beginning to feel surprisingly real, but both were beginning to suspect that their 2-year timeline might prove insufficient for everything they'd inadvertently committed to building together. The learning phase was revealing not just new skills and perspectives, but fundamental questions about what they actually wanted from this arrangement and from each other. The answers, when they came, would challenge everything they thought they knew about business, partnership, and the carefully constructed walls they built around their hearts. The first crack in their carefully constructed partnership appeared 6 weeks into their marriage, delivered in the form of a manila envelope slipped under their front door at dawn. Sandro found it while leaving for his morning run, his name written in familiar handwriting that made his stomach drop. Inside were photographs, him and Francesca, working together in their renovation workshop, sharing coffee on their front porch, walking through the historic district during community meetings. Innocent images that would mean nothing to most observers, but the accompanying note made the threat explicit. "Your new wife doesn't know about the warehouse fire, does she? Amazing what people will overlook when they think they're in love. Call me, or she learns exactly who she married. Richard." Sandro sank into their kitchen chair, the photographs scattered before him like evidence of a crime. The warehouse fire. 3 years ago, before he'd met Richard, before he'd agreed to infiltrate Francesca's company. A night that had changed everything, that had driven him to make choices he'd never fully reconciled with his conscience. The fire had consumed a building that housed several small businesses, including a furniture workshop where Sandro had served as mentor to a group of at-risk teenagers. The official investigation had ruled it electrical failure, but Sandro knew better. The building's owner had been pressuring tenants to vacate so he could sell to developers, had been systematically neglecting maintenance to make their working conditions unbearable. On the night of the fire, Sandro had been in the building late, working on a commission piece. He'd smelled smoke, evacuated everyone he could find, called emergency services. But what the investigators never discovered was that he'd also found evidence of deliberate sabotage, damaged wiring that looked professional, insurance documents that revealed the owner's financial motivations. Rather than turning the evidence over to authorities, Sandro had kept it, used it to force the building owner to establish a compensation fund for the displaced businesses, to ensure the teenagers in his program had resources to continue their education. It had been justice of a sort, but it had also been extortion, leverage obtained through withholding evidence from a criminal. Investigation. Richard had discovered this secret during their initial meetings, had used it as additional motivation for Sandro to cooperate with the corporate espionage plan. "We're both people who understand that sometimes justice requires operating outside official channels," he'd said. It had felt like understanding then. Now it felt like manipulation. Sandro understood why Richard was resurfacing this now. The community development project he and Francesca were planning threatened several of Richard's own business interests in the area. If their partnership succeeded, if they demonstrated that profitable development could coexist with historic preservation, it would undermine the aggressive gentrification strategies that formed the foundation of Richard's real estate empire. The photographs weren't just blackmail material. They were reconnaissance. Richard was documenting that Sandro and Francesca's marriage had evolved beyond strategic arrangement into something more complex and potentially vulnerable. When Francesca emerged from her morning routine, she found Sandro standing at their kitchen window, staring out at the garden they'd been planning together. "You look like someone died," she said, pouring coffee with her usual efficiency. "Bored, meeting anxiety, or something else?" Sandro turned to face her, seeing her clearly in the morning light. Over the past 6 weeks, subtle changes had emerged in her appearance and demeanor. She smiled more easily, spoke with less calculated precision during their private conversations. The corporate armor was still there when needed, but it no longer seemed permanently fused to her personality. "We need to talk about something," he said carefully. "About my past, and about threats to our current arrangement." Francesca's expression shifted immediately to high alert. She set down her coffee mug and gave him her complete attention, the way she did during crisis management situations. "What kind of threats?" Sandro showed her the photographs and note, watching her face as she absorbed the implications. Her expression remained neutral, but he could see her mind working through strategies and defensive positions. "Richard's escalating his pressure," she said finally. "This suggests our community development project is threatening his interests more than we anticipated. That's not the only problem." Sandro took a breath and told her about the warehouse fire, about the evidence he'd withheld, about the compromises he'd made in pursuit of what he'd believed was justice. He spoke carefully but completely, understanding that this revelation could destroy not just their partnership, but potentially her entire perception of who he was. Francesca listened without interruption, her expression growing more thoughtful as the story unfolded. When he finished, she was quiet for several minutes, processing the information with the same analytical approach she brought to complex business problems. "So you committed extortion to ensure displaced business owners received compensation," she said. "Eventually, I withheld evidence from a criminal investigation for personal leverage. That's obstruction of justice at minimum. Were the displaced businesses adequately compensated?" "Better than they would have been through official channels." Francesca walked to the window where Sandro had been standing, looking out at their garden project. "Richard knew about this when he recruited you for corporate espionage. He used it as leverage." "Yes. And now he's using it as leverage again, but this time against our marriage rather than against me." She turned back to face him. "The question is whether you think I'm naive enough to be shocked by evidence that you're capable of operating outside official channels to achieve necessary outcomes." Sandro stared at her. "You're not horrified that I've been lying to you about my past?" "You haven't lied. You've omitted details that weren't relevant to our current partnership." Francesca's tone was matter-of-fact. "I've done worse things in service of business objectives, and with less noble motivations, than ensuring displaced teenagers had educational resources. This could destroy your reputation if it becomes public. Only if I allow it to be framed as scandal rather than evidence that I'm partnered with someone who understands that sometimes conventional systems fail people who need protection." She paused, a slight smile emerging. "Besides, the worst thing Richard can prove is that my husband is capable of taking decisive action when institutions fail to provide justice. That actually enhances rather than damages the narrative we're building." Sandro felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of tension he'd carried for 3 years. But alongside relief came confusion about Francesca's reaction. "Why aren't you more upset about this? Why aren't you more upset about this?" "Because I've spent 6 weeks learning who you are through your actions rather than your resume," she replied. "The man who spends evenings teaching me woodworking techniques, who insisted we involve community representatives in development planning, who turned corporate espionage into community advocacy. That man is capable of bending rules when conventional approaches fail people who need protection. You're taking this remarkably well for someone who claims to value strategic control. Above all else, I'm taking this well because it confirms rather than contradicts everything I've learned about your character. Francesca walked to their renovation plans, spread across the kitchen table. The question isn't whether I can trust someone who's made morally complex choices. The question is whether we can use this situation to our advantage, rather than allowing Richard to control the narrative. For the next hour, they developed a strategy that turned Richard's blackmail attempt into an opportunity to strengthen their position. Rather than responding defensively, they would proactively reach out to community leaders and business partners, framing Sandro's past as evidence of his commitment to ensuring justice when conventional systems failed. But as they worked through tactical responses, Sandro recognized that something fundamental had shifted in their relationship. Francesca's reaction to his revelation had demonstrated a level of trust and acceptance that went far beyond strategic alliance. She hadn't just forgiven his past choices. She'd integrated them into a more complex understanding of his character. Realization was both comforting and terrifying. Somewhere in their weeks of collaboration and cohabitation, they'd stopped being strategic partners and become something more complicated, more vulnerable, and more real than either had intended to allow. As they prepared to face Richard's escalating threats, both understood that they were no longer just protecting a business arrangement or community development project. They were protecting something neither had expected to find, a partnership that had become worth defending for its own sake, regardless of the strategic advantages it provided. Deeper challenge wasn't just external pressure from Richard's blackmail attempts. It was the recognition that their carefully controlled arrangement had evolved into something that could actually be lost, something worth fighting for in ways that went beyond business objectives or community advocacy. The stakes had fundamentally changed, and with them, everything they thought they knew about what they were willing to risk to protect what they'd built together. The crisis arrived. 3 weeks later, in Francesca's boardroom, delivered with the precision of a surgical strike. Richard Blackstone sat at the conference table like he belonged there, flanked by 2 lawyers and a private investigator, presenting evidence to Lyscourt Industries' board of directors that threatened to destroy everything Francesca and Sandro had built together. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard began, his voice carrying the smooth confidence that had once convinced Francesca to trust him with her heart and her business secrets. "I present evidence that your CEO has compromised this company's integrity through a fraudulent marriage designed to conceal corporate espionage and criminal activity. Presentation was masterful in its calculated destruction." Richard had compiled financial records, surveillance photographs, testimony from former employees, and legal documentation that painted Sandro as a career criminal who had systematically infiltrated and manipulated Francesca for corporate gain. The warehouse fire evidence was presented not as justice-seeking, but as proof of extortion capabilities. Their community development project was characterized as a money laundering scheme disguised as historic preservation. Francesca sat at the head of the table, maintaining perfect composure, while watching her professional reputation and personal life dismantled with surgical precision. The board members, men and women she'd worked with for years, listened with expressions ranging from shock to barely concealed satisfaction. Some had never fully accepted her leadership. Others had been waiting for an opportunity to challenge her authority. "The marriage itself," Richard continued, displaying their wedding photographs alongside bank records and email communications, "appears to be a calculated arrangement designed to legitimize Mr. Drameer's access to confidential business information and provide legal protection against prosecution for his previous criminal activities." Harold Steinberg, the board member who'd consistently opposed Francesca's community-focused business strategies, leaned forward with obvious interest. "These are serious allegations, Richard. What exactly are you proposing?" "I'm proposing that this board take immediate action to protect the company's shareholders and reputation," Richard replied smoothly. Ms. Lyscourt has clearly been compromised by personal entanglements that threaten her judgment and our fiduciary responsibilities. The implications hung in the air like poison gas. Richard wasn't just attacking Sandro's credibility. He was positioning himself to trigger the corporate governance clauses that could force Francesca from her CEO position if the board determined she'd acted against shareholder interests. "I'd like to respond to these allegations," Francesca said calmly. But Richard held up a hand. "I'm afraid there's more." He nodded to his private investigator, who distributed additional documents to board members. "We've also discovered that Mr. Dremir has been systematically gathering information about board members' personal lives, business relationships, and financial activities. What we initially thought was corporate espionage against Ms. Lyscourt appears to be part of a larger intelligence gathering operation against this entire organization." The accusation was breathtaking in its audacity and devastating in its implications. Board members began examining the documents with increasing alarm, finding details about their personal lives that should have been private, business relationships that could be embarrassing if made public. Francesca realized with growing horror that Richard had been monitoring not just her company but her board members, gathering leverage against anyone who might support her leadership. The intelligence about board members hadn't come from Sandro. It had come from Richard's own surveillance operations. But he was presenting it as evidence of Sandro's criminal activity, while using it to intimidate the people who could protect her. "This is character assassination," she said firmly. "Richard, you're manipulating information to serve your personal vendetta against me and sabotage business strategies that threaten your own interests. Can you prove that your husband didn't gather this information?" Richard asked with mock sympathy. "Can you demonstrate that your judgment hasn't been compromised by personal involvement with someone who has systematically deceived you about his background and motivations?" The question struck at the heart of Francesca's vulnerability. She couldn't prove Sandro's innocence because Richard had crafted his accusations to exploit the very secrecy that had made their original arrangement necessary. The board saw evidence of corporate infiltration and criminal behavior. They had no way to understand the complex evolution of her relationship with Sandro or the genuine partnership they'd developed. "I move for a vote of no confidence," Harold announced, clearly prepared for this moment. "Ms. Lyscourt's personal judgment has been compromised to a degree that threatens our fiduciary responsibilities to shareholders." "Seconded," came from Margaret Walsh, another board member who'd opposed Francesca's community development strategies. Francesca felt the room shifting against her like a tide turning. Years of building relationships, demonstrating competence, and delivering results were being swept away by Richard's carefully orchestrated character assassination. She looked around the table at colleagues who'd worked with her for years, seeing doubt and calculation rather than loyalty or trust. "Before you vote," she said, standing with as much dignity as she could muster, "I want you to understand what you're really voting for. You're voting to reward a man who has systematically stalked and surveilled members of this board to gather blackmail material. You're voting to punish community development strategies that would create sustainable long-term value for shareholders and stakeholders. You're voting to return control to someone who believes that corporate success requires destroying communities and exploiting workers. We're voting to protect this company from leadership that has been compromised by criminal associations." Harold replied coldly. The vote was closer than Richard had expected, but decisive enough to achieve his objectives. 7 board members voted for the motion of no confidence, 5 against. Francesca was removed from her CEO position, effective immediately, pending a full investigation of her business practices and personal conduct. As the boardroom emptied, Richard approached Francesca with the satisfied expression of someone who'd achieved total victory. "You could have avoided this," he said quietly, "if you'd simply chosen different business strategies, if you hadn't gotten involved with that man, if you'd remembered that sentiment is expensive. What do you want, Richard? What do you want, Richard?" I want you to understand that actions have consequences. You chose to oppose my business interests, to align yourself with someone who represents everything weak and unprofitable about sentimental business practices. He straightened his tie with casual satisfaction. Now you'll learn what happens to people who prioritize community development over shareholder value. Francesca left the boardroom that had been the center of her professional life, carrying only her personal items in a cardboard box that seemed to mock everything she'd achieved. Security escorted her from the building she'd commanded that morning, past employees who stared with combinations of curiosity and sympathy. She found Sandro waiting in the parking garage, having somehow learned about the board meeting's outcome. His face was grim but not surprised. He'd anticipated this possibility since Richard's blackmail letter arrived. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "For what?" "For being the reason you lost everything you built." Francesca looked at him standing beside their shared car, this man who'd inadvertently become the center of her personal and professional destruction. 6 months ago, she would have agreed with his assessment, would have blamed him for the vulnerability that Richard had exploited. Now, she realized that losing her CEO position hurt less than the possibility of losing Sandro himself hurt. The recognition shocked her with its clarity and its implications. "I didn't lose everything," she said finally. "I lost a job. There's a difference. That job was your identity, your life's work." "No," Francesca replied, understanding something fundamental for the first time. "That job was what I did. It wasn't who I am." As they drove home to the house they'd renovated together, past the community they'd been working to preserve, Francesca felt something she hadn't experienced since her grandfather's death, the strange liberation of having nothing left to lose. Richard had destroyed her corporate identity, but he'd also accidentally freed her from the prison of strategic thinking that had defined her adult life. The crisis had stripped away everything she'd thought she needed to be happy and successful. What remained was the question of what she actually wanted to build from the wreckage, and whether the partnership she'd discovered with Sandro was strong enough to survive the loss of everything that had originally made it necessary. The answer to that question would determine not just their future but their understanding of what they'd actually created together during their months of collaboration, compromise, and unexpected trust. The breakthrough came at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday, 2 weeks after Francesca's public humiliation and corporate exile. She found herself standing in their workshop, surrounded by the scent of sawdust and wood polish, watching Sandro complete a custom dining table he'd been crafting for a family in the historic district. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked without looking up from the intricate inlay work he was creating. "I keep thinking about what Richard said. About consequences and sentiment being expensive." Francesca picked up a piece of sandpaper, running her thumb along its gritty surface. "He was right, you know. Everything I lost was because I chose sentiment over strategy. Is that what you think happened? I chose to trust you despite evidence that you'd infiltrated my company for corporate espionage. I chose to develop feelings for someone who represented everything my business training taught me to avoid. I chose community development over profitable demolition." She set down the sandpaper and faced him directly. Every choice was sentimental rather than strategic. Sandro stopped working and gave her his complete attention. Over the past 2 weeks, he'd watched Francesca struggle with the destruction of her corporate identity, but tonight felt different. Tonight felt like she was working towards some kind of resolution. "And do you regret those choices?" The question hung between them in the workshop's warm light. Francesca considered everything she'd lost: the corner office, the corporate power, the financial security, the professional identity she'd spent 15 years building. Then she considered what she'd gained: genuine partnership, authentic collaboration, work that served communities rather than exploiting them. "No," she said, the word emerging with surprising clarity. "I don't regret them. But I think I've been framing them wrong." "How so?" "I've been thinking of this as sentiment versus strategy, emotion versus logic, weakness versus strength. She walked to the window that overlooked their garden, where moonlight illuminated the vegetable beds they'd planned together. But what if it's not about choosing between those things? What if it's about recognizing that the best strategies serve human needs rather than abstract profit margins? Sandro joined her at the window, close enough that she could feel his warmth without touching. Explain that. Richard's approach works in the short term because it exploits immediate opportunities without regard for long-term consequences. Demolish historic buildings for quick development profits. Extract maximum value from workers without investing in their well-being. Manipulate relationships for temporary advantage. She turned to face him. But that's not actually strategic. That's tactical thinking disguised as strategy. And true strategy would be building systems that create sustainable value over time. Preserving community assets that appreciate rather than consuming resources that can't be replaced. Investing in partnerships that strengthen rather than exploiting vulnerabilities that weaken. Francesca felt ideas crystallizing as she spoke. Everything we've done together, everything Richard characterized as weakness, it's actually more strategic than anything I accomplished as CEO. Sandro studied her face in the moonlight. You're talking about starting over. I'm talking about starting better. She moved closer to him, no longer maintaining the careful physical distance that had characterized their early cohabitation. Richard destroyed my corporate position because he correctly identified that our partnership threatened his business model. But he made a crucial miscalculation, which was, he assumed that destroying my access to corporate resources would destroy our ability to implement community development strategies. Francesca smiled, feeling pieces of a larger plan falling into place. He didn't consider that corporate resources were actually limiting our potential rather than enabling it. Over the next hour, standing in their workshop surrounded by evidence of Sandro's craftsmanship and their shared vision, Francesca outlined a business model that integrated everything they'd learned about sustainable development, community partnership, and authentic collaboration. Rather than trying to regain corporate position, they would establish an independent development company focused exclusively on historic preservation and community revitalization. Rather than competing with Richard's aggressive gentrification strategies, they would demonstrate alternative approaches that created value for investors. While serving community needs, we use your craftsmanship expertise and my business experience to develop a model that other cities can replicate, she explained, pacing the workshop as ideas emerged. Historic preservation as economic development, community partnership as competitive advantage, sustainable practices as long-term profitability. That would require significant startup capital, which we can obtain through impact. Investors who prioritize social return alongside financial return. The community development work we've already done provides proof of concept. Francesca felt the familiar excitement of strategic planning, but now it was grounded in purposes beyond personal advancement. Plus, we have something Richard doesn't: credibility with the communities we serve. You want to compete directly with him. I want to make his approach obsolete. She stopped pacing and looked at Sandro directly. But I can't do it alone. This only works as genuine partnership, not as employer and employee or strategic alliance. Equal partners, shared risk, shared decision-making authority. Sandro was quiet for several minutes, absorbing the implications of what she was proposing. It would mean abandoning the careful boundaries they'd maintained, fully committing to a business and personal partnership that could succeed spectacularly or fail catastrophically. What about our 2-year timeline? He asked. Our original agreement was temporary arrangement with defined exit strategies. Our original agreement was corporate blackmail disguised as strategic partnership, Francesca replied with dry humor. I think we've moved considerably beyond those terms. Are you asking me to extend our business partnership or our marriage? The question cut to the heart of what had been developing between them for months, but never explicitly addressed. Their relationship had evolved far beyond the strategic arrangement that had brought them together, but neither had been willing to acknowledge how fundamental the change had become. "I'm asking if you want to build something real together," Francesca said, her voice carrying none of the corporate control that had once characterized her important conversations. Business partnership and marriage, professional collaboration, and personal commitment. Not because circumstances force us to, but because we choose to. Sandro crossed the workshop to stand directly in front of her, close enough to see the vulnerability behind her strategic planning. The woman behind the business proposal. Woman behind the business proposal. "I've been in love with you for 2 months," he said simply. Not with the CEO or the strategic alliance, but with the person who learned to restore crown molding because she wanted to understand what made me passionate about craftsmanship. The person who redesigned an entire development project because she realized community preservation was more important than maximum profit extraction. Francesca felt her carefully, maintained composure finally crack, not from professional pressure, but from personal honesty that she'd avoided. Acknowledging, "I've been terrified of admitting that," she said quietly. "Love was the thing I eliminated from my decision-making process because it represented loss of control, potential for exploitation, strategic vulnerability. And now I think eliminating love from decision-making was the least strategic choice I ever made." She reached for his hands, noting how her corporate manicure had given way to calluses from renovation work. Love isn't strategic vulnerability. It's strategic advantage, because it motivates choices that serve long-term partnership rather than short-term individual gain. They stood together in their workshop, surrounded by evidence of collaboration and creation, finally acknowledging what had been building between them since those first conversations about community development and mutual respect. The breakthrough wasn't just personal recognition of their feelings for each other. It was understanding that their love had emerged from and was strengthened by their professional partnership, that emotional commitment, strategic thinking could reinforce rather than conflict with each other. "So we're really doing this," Sandro said. "Building a company together, staying married for real, competing with Richard's empire using community development as our competitive advantage. We're doing this," Francesca confirmed, feeling more certain than she'd felt about any business decision in her career. "But first, we're taking our honeymoon. The real one this time." As dawn broke over Millbrook Heights, illuminating their renovated home and the community they'd chosen to serve, Francesca and Sandro began planning not just a business venture, but a life together. The crisis that had seemed to destroy everything had actually cleared away the artificial constraints and strategic limitations that had prevented them from building what they truly wanted. Richard's attack had inadvertently freed them to create something more ambitious, more authentic, and more strategically sound than anything either could have accomplished alone. The breakthrough was recognizing that their greatest strength lay not in individual achievement, but in genuine partnership that served purposes larger than themselves. Comeback that would surprise everyone was just beginning. 3 months after losing her corporate position, Francesca stood in what had once been an abandoned textile factory, now transformed into the headquarters of Drangmer Lyscourt Community Development. The exposed brick walls showcased Sandro's restored woodwork installations, while her sleek technology infrastructure created modern functionality within historic architecture. The space embodied everything they'd learned about blending preservation with innovation. The Riverside Neighborhood Association has agreed to the pilot program, Sandro announced, entering their shared office with a stack of signed partnership agreements. Full community input on the restoration of the old library building, with local hiring requirements and skills training components. Francesca looked up from her computer, where she'd been finalizing contracts with impact investors who prioritize social return alongside financial profit. Their business model was attracting attention from development firms across the region, but more importantly, it was demonstrating measurable results in the communities they served. Blackstone, Enterprises submitted a counteroffer this morning, she said, holding up a legal document. Richard's trying to outbid us for the library project. With what approach? Standard gentrification strategy. Demolish the existing structure, build luxury condos, market them as heritage-inspired living, without any actual historic preservation. Francesca set down the document with visible distaste. Higher profit margins, faster timeline, zero community engagement. Sandro joined her at their planning table, where architectural drawings and financial projections covered every available surface. Over the past months, they developed a working rhythm that maximized both their expertise and their growing understanding of each other's professional strengths. The community association specifically requested our approach because they want genuine preservation, he said. Richard can offer more money, but he can't offer authentic collaboration or respect for neighborhood character, which is exactly why our model is threatening him. Francesca pulled up market analysis reports on her tablet. We've secured 4 major projects in the past 2 months, all in areas where Richard had planned aggressive development. Our community partnership approach is undermining his entire business strategy. The evidence was mounting that their unconventional approach was not just morally satisfying but financially viable. Property values in their completed projects had increased substantially, but without the displacement and cultural destruction that characterized traditional gentrification. Local businesses were thriving, longtime residents remained in their neighborhoods, and investor returns met or exceeded market expectations. There's something else, Sandro said, his tone suggesting complications ahead. Margaret Walsh called this morning. 3 more Lyscourt Industries board members want to meet with us privately. Francesca raised an eyebrow. Margaret had been one of the board members who'd voted for her removal, but recent developments suggested some regrets about that decision. What kind of meeting? The kind where they ask if we'd consider returning to run the company, under new terms that give us complete autonomy over community development strategies, offer represented vindication of everything they'd argued for during Francesca's final months as CEO. The board was recognizing that her community-focused approaches had been strategically sound rather than sentimental weakness. But returning to corporate leadership would mean abandoning the independence they'd built together. Richard must be panicking if board members are approaching us directly, Francesca mused. His entire plan depended on isolating us professionally and financially. Instead, we've created a business model that's more successful than anything he imagined. Are you interested in going back? Francesca considered the question seriously. 6 months ago, she would have jumped at the chance to reclaim her corporate position and prove Richard wrong about her leadership capabilities. Now, the offer felt like a step backward from the authentic partnership she'd built with Sandro. I'm interested in expanding our impact, she said finally, but not in returning to systems that constrain innovation or require compromise with board members who prioritize short-term profits over sustainable development. That afternoon, they met with Margaret Walsh and 2 other former colleagues at a coffee shop in the historic district they'd helped preserve. The conversation was illuminating in ways none of them had expected. Richard's aggressive development projects are failing, Margaret admitted. Community opposition is stronger than anticipated, cost overruns are substantial, and investor confidence is declining. Meanwhile, your projects are succeeding financially while building positive community relationships. We'd like to propose a merger, added Thomas Chun, Lyscourt Industries' former CFO. Dramer Lyscourt Community Development becomes the Community Relations Division of Lyscourt Industries, with complete operational independence and expanded resources. Francesca and Sandro exchanged glances, recognizing the strategic implications. Such a merger would give them access to corporate-level resources while maintaining the community focus that made their work effective. But it would also put them back in direct competition with Richard's business interests. We'll consider it, Francesca replied diplomatically. but any arrangement would need to preserve our decision-making authority and community partnership requirements. As they walked home that evening, discussing the unexpected offer and its implications, both realized that their implementation phase had succeeded beyond their most optimistic projections. They'd proven that community-focused development could be more profitable and sustainable than exploitative approaches. More importantly, they demonstrated that their partnership could handle complex business challenges while maintaining the personal trust and mutual respect that had emerged from their unconventional beginning. The comeback that had started with losing everything was becoming a transformation of entire business approaches to community development. Richard's attempt to destroy them had inadvertently created space for innovation that was changing how development work functioned throughout the region. The final confrontation was approaching, and they were ready for it. 1 year later, Francesca stood before the Millbrook Heights City Council, presenting the quarterly report for Draymer-Lyscourt Community Development. The numbers spoke for themselves. 15 successful preservation projects, 340 permanent jobs created, property values increased by an average of 32%, and zero community displacement in any of their development areas. The Heritage District model has exceeded all projections, she announced to the packed council chamber. Community partnership isn't just ethically sound. It's more profitable than traditional development approaches. In the audience, Richard Blackstone sat with his remaining legal team, preparing for what everyone knew would be his final attempt to challenge their business practices. His own development company was facing bankruptcy after a series of project failures and community relations disasters. The man who'd once wielded corporate power like a weapon looked diminished, desperate. When the public comment period opened, Richard approached the podium with familiar arrogance, but his words lacked their former conviction. "This council shouldn't be fooled by feel-good rhetoric," he began. Ms. Lyscourt's marriage to her former employee was a calculated business arrangement designed to legitimize corporate espionage and fraud. Francesca felt Sandro's hand find hers as they sat together in the front row, no longer needing to maintain careful distances or strategic positioning. Their marriage had become the foundation of everything they'd built together, professionally and personally. "That's an interesting perspective, Richard," Francesca replied when invited to respond. "Because our calculated business arrangement has created more sustainable value for this community than your company managed in 20 years of operation." The council vote was unanimous. Draymer-Lyscourt Community Development would receive the contract for the city's largest historic preservation project, a $40 million initiative that would transform the abandoned industrial district into mixed-use space that preserved architectural heritage while creating modern amenities. Outside the courthouse, local news crews surrounded them for interviews, but Francesca and Sandro slipped away to their favorite coffee shop in the neighborhood they'd helped save from demolition. "Remember when you said, 'Become my husband or lose everything'?" Sandro asked, stirring sugar into his espresso. Francesca laughed, thinking about that desperate midnight ultimatum that had seemed like manipulation but had actually been the beginning of everything meaningful in both their lives. "I had no idea what I was asking for," she admitted. "I thought I was blackmailing you into a strategic alliance. Instead, you accidentally proposed the most successful partnership either of us could have imagined." They walked home through streets lined with restored buildings, past the workshop where Sandro still crafted custom furniture in the evenings, toward the house they'd renovated together and filled with evidence of their shared life. Their success had surprised everyone, including themselves, but the real shock had been discovering that love and strategic thinking could reinforce rather than undermine each other. The janitor's comeback had become a transformation of entire approaches to community development. The CEO's demand for marriage had become the foundation of authentic partnership. What had started as blackmail had become the blueprint for business practices that served community needs while generating sustainable profits. Their new normal was better than either had dared to hope when circumstances had first forced them together in that midnight confrontation that changed everything. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.